The choice of U.S. president will have implications also for Singapore, one of its closest regional partners on many fronts. Both Harris and Trump are no strangers to Singapore. Marcus Tan brings us some highlights of this relationship.
The first time former US President Donald Trump met then Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in the flesh was on the sidelines of the G20 in Hamburg, Germany. It was July 2017, less than a year after Mr. Trump took the Oval Office. He called ties between the two countries big, and that they would likely get much larger over time. That same year, he invited Mr. Lee to the White House.
Throughout Southeast Asia, the United States and Singapore are currently working to enhance the capacity of law enforcement, fight terrorism, and bolster cyber defenses. Our two nations also share an unwavering commitment to countering the North Korean threat and promoting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea.
Once again, Mr. Trump also reaffirmed the US's commitment to Singapore and ASEAN. Months later, he was in Singapore to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at a historic summit. Coincidentally, it was Mr. Trump's first presidential visit to the city-state. He was not only hosted to lunch, but also given an early birthday celebration. In 2019, meeting for the fourth time, both men were in New York to sign an updated 1990 defense deal, key to America's use of Singapore's military bases. Similar sentiments also by incumbent US Vice President Kamala Harris during her first official visit to the region, where Singapore was one of two stops.
I am here in Singapore as a reaffirmation of our commitment to our membership in the Indo-Pacific region, our partnership, long-standing partnerships with Southeast Asia, and a long-standing relationship with Singapore as it relates to our issues and our mutual issues on security and economic strength and development, and now increasingly global health.
In March 2022, they met again, this time in DC. One issue they agreed on was the importance of global rules and norms, especially with war just happening in Ukraine. Under the Biden administration, both nations continued deeper cooperation in areas such as climate change, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies. Come election day, be it Harris or Trump, the 47th president must decide the role of the US in the Indo-Pacific. That includes how to tend to its enduring friendship with Singapore.
And for more on the potential impact on foreign policy, we have with us Professor Joseph Liow, Dean at the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at NTU Singapore. He's joined by Associate Professor John Donaldson from the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University. Welcome to the studio, gentlemen. Professor Liow, let's start with you. Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Singapore leaders before him have spent years meeting US leaders. How much of such good Singapore and US ties depend on good relationships and personal friendships? What does it mean for Prime Minister Lawrence Wong as well?
Well, I think personal connections have always been important. I mean, you cast your mind back to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, our late founding Prime Minister, and the relationships that he had with a string of American presidents and secretaries of state, right? Mr. Goh Chok Tong playing golf with Bill Clinton, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong's personal relationships with George W. Bush, with Barack Obama were quite critical as well in terms of advancing bilateral relations. So it's something that PM Lawrence Wong will have to pay some attention to. He's no stranger to the United States. He's very familiar with American culture, American music, American sports. So there will be a number of points of connections that he can quite easily make. But having said that, relations cannot just depend on personal relationships. They have to very much be institutionalized as well. And I think both the United States and Singapore have paid a lot of attention to that. And as a result, we have a string of agreements over a raft of issues that really anchor the relationship. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well.
When it comes to bilateral ties, Professor Donaldson, would you say that they were better during the Trump presidency between 2017 and 2021, or under the Biden administration with Kamala Harris as the vice president?
I think as far as the Trump administration is concerned, there were two major kinds of concerns. One was Trump's, America First policy really concerned a lot of America's traditional allies, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. And Singapore, of course, is one of the cornerstone, really, of American chain of alliances. And with its nativist policy, I think it really became quite a concern. And then in terms of his unpredictable foreign policy, especially in terms of Asia's flashpoints, his policy towards accommodation of North Korea really concerned a lot of his allies. And then the idea whether he would start to withdraw American troops from the region as well. And the second is in terms of trade. And his, Singapore is very dependent upon a free trade system that has been developed over the past decades. In the first Trump administration, we saw a lot of trade sanctions come into force. He's talking about a 20% tariff across the board. And what would happen to America's free trade agreements, including the one with Singapore, under that kind of circumstances? He's left very, very vague. And I think both of those issues, in terms of security, in terms of free trade, are concerning to countries like Singapore, that has traditionally been one of America's strongest allies.
But you were talking about Trump's unpredictability there, but how confident are you that if Harris wins, ties will remain as they are?
I think one of the things is that she is inheriting Biden's, diplomacy team, and or she can pick and choose among the experts that have come, under Biden. Biden, had been in the Senate Foreign Policy Committee for many, many decades. He really worked hard to reassure allies in Europe and in Asia that America was still had its back. Harris, on her own terms, also has some foreign policy experience, but more importantly, she has a deep bench to choose from in terms of advisors, and I think she'll be a quick study. The big question, though, for any Harris administration is when she's first tested, and traditionally American presidents get tested by some of our adversaries, and what will be her response, and that will set the tone for any Harris administration.
All right, before we carry on, let's take a different look at Singapore's friendship with the U.S. in the context of other competing influences in the region. Now, the biggest of which is China. Its territorial claims in the South China Sea with a 9-dash line is in dispute with ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei. More recently, Coast Guard vessels from some of these nations have been in multiple standoffs in these waters lately. Then there is the Taiwan issue. China sees the island as a part of its territory, but the U.S. sees Taiwan as a strategic partner, vowing to defend the island if it were ever attacked. Now, the U.S. also sends warships to the area to exercise what it calls freedom of navigation. When Harris was VP, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022. She was the highest-ranking U.S. official to do so. The visit sparked outrage from China. Top military leaders from the U.S. and China did not meet for more than a year after this. Now, another flashpoint is on the Korean Peninsula, both North and South still technically at war. The U.S. has a permanent military presence in the South, and China is a firm supporter of the North, which is now also getting closer to Russia. In September, Singapore's defense minister said that the region must have enough mechanisms to ensure no single factor, including the U.S. president, can affect the security architecture. He was speaking at a security forum in Beijing. Professor Donaldson, we are looking at tensions over the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the Korean Peninsula. Which of these flashpoints could impact Singapore the greatest under a Trump or Harris presidency?
I hate to say both, but it's really both. I think the South China Seas is not just an issue for Singapore's neighbors, and the future of ASEAN, but it's also an important conduit for trade, which is something that Singapore depends upon. There is no greater flashpoint than this Taiwan issue. And Trump has rhetorically not been nearly as supportive, whereas the Biden administration has unprecedented moves, including the Pelosi visit that we just were reminded of, but also in his very clearly stating that if China took arms, that the U.S. would intervene. And that is something that no U.S. president has said because of the policy of strategic ambiguity. Trump has been much more critical of the island's ability to defend itself and really has seemed to be less than reassuring in terms of, America's ties to Taiwan.
You mentioned both referring to the South China Sea.
South China Sea and Taiwan.
What about the Korean Peninsula?
The Korean Peninsula. So all three. There really is no other flashpoint that could lead to nuclear war than the one in the Korean Peninsula. And the unpredictability of a Trump administration in terms of its willingness to accommodate the Kim administration really has been made South Korea's government quite nervous. And anything that happens in the Korean Peninsula will, of course, affect China, will affect all of ASEAN, and world trade will be just the beginning of the problems in any kind of flashpoint there.
Professor Liow, let me quote our defense minister. He has said that it isn't productive to figure out what happens in the U.S. and that Singapore's peace and prosperity cannot be solely dependent on the leader of another country. Between Harris and Trump, whom do you think would better ensure Singapore's security interests from its perspective?
I think Defence Minister Ng's point really reflects the thinking of our leadership that essentially, whether it's Harris or Trump, Singapore will have to work with them. And that is indeed true, right? As to which one will better affect us, I think there are a number of things we have to consider. If you look at how Singapore's relations with the US has progressed with the Biden administration and with the Trump administration. I mean, if you set aside all the fireworks and stuff like that in relation to the Trump administration, there were successes, right? I mean, there were developments. The enhanced defense cooperation relationship agreement, for example. So it's not that we didn't make any progress, but of course, what you have is a situation where in Harris administration, things will be more predictable, they are more familiar, more institutionalized. With a Trump administration, number one, he's likely to personalize a lot of things, so there needs to be some adjustment for that. Number two, it's quite clear that he is going to want to significantly alter the dynamics of global trade far more than a Harris administration. Yeah, and as John mentioned earlier, for Singapore, as an open economy, very reliant on free trade, global trade, this is something that we will have to adjust to as well. So these are the challenges with either administration.
Okay, we've been talking about security interests, but one of the hallmarks of the Trump administration was also his constant bashing of the global institutions and regional security constructs like NATO. In fact, in December 2016, he called the United Nations a club for people to talk and have a good time. Some of the things the US did under his charge, it threatened the International Criminal Court with criminal prosecution, pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council and the UNESCO, left the Paris Climate Agreement, and stopped funding the World Health Organization. Now, Professor Liow, whether it's continuity under Democratic President Kamala Harris or a shift with the return of Donald Trump, how would policies on the rules-based multilateral system and regional security constructs like ASEAN affect Singapore? Well,
as far as President Trump is concerned, he makes it very clear. He's made it very clear. He's no fan of multilateralism. So this will be a challenge for a country like Singapore, who are we're very ardent advocates of multilateralism. Yeah. But at the same time, we're talking about a United States that, regardless of administrations over the course of recent history, they pursue their interests. Insofar as multilateral institutions facilitate that, they're happy to go along with it. If multilateral institutions, in whatever way, obstruct the interests of the United States, and it doesn't just apply to the United States, it's any power. Yeah, they're just as happy to find other ways, right? Casting aside commitments to multilateralism. This is the nature of international affairs. For Singapore, smaller country, it's different. We're very committed to multilateralism, and we have to find ways to make it work, right? Whether trying to persuade major powers like the United States, like China, to invest in these institutions, to commit to it, or work with other like-minded countries in order to make sure that cooperation exists and there's a convergence of interest to move things forward. And I think that is critical given the state of the world today and really the diminution of the influence of multilateral institutions.
All right, and Singapore says it will engage with whoever is victorious in this U.S. election. Professor Donaldson, how different will this level and scale of engagement have to be depending on who becomes the next U.S. president?
I think because the two are really quite different, I think Singapore's strategy, of course, will be quite different. And they have to engage, and Professor Liow made that point, I think, very, very clear. One of the things that I think is quite symbolic, the list of attacks on multilateral organizations that you just, and there's none greater, I think, in terms of Singapore's point of view than one that you didn't mention because it's a really long list, which is him pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on his very first day, which would have created not just a trade, but more of a community across the Pacific. And Singapore would have been at the heart of it. And for Trump to pull out of it on the very first day of his administration, very clear campaign promise, sends a signal about to Singapore and other allies in the region about his foreign policy. That's very difficult to engage because he is not just not committed to multilateralism, he's committed to isolationism. And history has shown us that when America takes an isolationist stand, many, many problems start to emerge. World War I, World War II, just to begin the list. And, Harris instinctively will be more multilateral, will be much more, as Professor Liow pointed out, professionalized, institutionalized, and be much easier to engage. Will it be easy? No. But the relationship never has been easy. There's lots of problems. The rise of China, North Korea, South China Seas, the Taiwan issue, all of these things, Singapore, US, and its allies have to work together. But Singapore will find a much more engaged partner in a Harris administration than it would in a Trump administration. That much is clear.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and thoughts. We were speaking there with Professor Joseph Liow, Dean at the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at NTU Singapore, and Associate Professor John Donaldson from the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University. Thank you.